Hi everybody, welcome to Do You Believe on ParanormalZoneTV. This is a live broadcast. Everybody, thanks so much for joining me tonight, and for those who are joining us for the first time, would you please subscribe to the show? I'd really appreciate it. Now tonight I'm really excited. I'm so pleased to bring to you Dr. Richard Spence. He is a professor of history at the University of Idaho, and he is a scholar and researcher. He is also the author of Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult. And Dr. Spence has been on many documentaries. You can see him on the History Channel, and he has also been on Coast to Coast. So everybody, let's welcome Dr. Spence. Good evening, Dr. Spence, and thanks so much for joining me.
Good evening, Norene, and thanks for having me on, and hello to everybody else.
Yeah, Go ahead, honey. I'm sorry.
No, I was saying, I have to say that I was on the History Channel years ago, and back when they had a show called Movies in Time, and I was one of the talking heads talking about a movie they had on, but I'm not sure whether that would ever resurface. And, in fact, I was on Coast to Coast not long after the Secret Agent 666 book was published, talking about, guess what? Aleister Crowley.
Right.
So we're talking about him again tonight.
Yes, and I'm really excited about that. I did a show, but we just touched on him because it was a show on the occult. And so let's talk about, now there may be some viewers that don't know that much about Crowley or have just heard his name. So before we go into the intelligence part from your book, can we give the viewers information about Aleister Crowley?
Well, Aleister Crowley is one of those people. If you haven't heard of him, you arguably haven't been listening, closely to things going on around you, because he's sometimes described as, I guarantee you that you've seen if you've never heard his name, you've probably seen his face. If you've ever looked at the Beatles, Sgt. Pepper's album, he's on there. There's an interesting, interesting that of all the people they could pick among the others to be on there, that he's chosen in that.
And why do you think that was? Why do you think?
Well, it was a number of reasons about it. One, this was the 1960s. There was a revival of interest. One of the things about Crowley we may get into is that he was a kind of prophet of the counterculture before there was what we tend to think of as a counterculture. So there was a big revival of interest in him. The Beatles were also British, and he was British, and of course probably better known there and elsewhere. And his face pops up as one of these little icons on the album. There was a survey, I think, of the 100 most famous Britons of all time, done sometime back. I'm trying to think, in the 1990s, and Crowley's right up there. He manages to get listed in that. That's kind of interesting for a man whose reputation for much of his life was, and still is in many areas, a rather negative one. He's a very polarizing figure. And I guess one of the things that I need to say before we go any further in this discussion is that I'm not a follower of Crowley. I'm not a Thelemite. I'm not a believer in his particular brand of spiritualism. Never tried out any of his rituals, or anybody else's for that matter. That's not really the part about him that specifically interests in me. On the other hand, I don't hold a great deal against him. He's a polarizing guy in that there are people, and there's a not tiny community of people who view him as a kind of prophet, which is what he aspired to be. That's really what Crowley saw himself as, was a prophet in the mold of Jesus and Muhammad and Moses. He was going to introduce a new spiritual eon. A whole new religious paradigm was going to sweep the world. It didn't quite work out that way, but he does have followers. And there are people who are very devoted to his ideas, still see him as a spiritual teacher. That's not the way that I approach him. I respect that that's the way that those people do it. On the other hand, there are people, the opposite side of that is Aleister Crowley, arch-Satanist of the 20th century. There were even people in Britain at the time, the wickedest man alive. That's one of the things you'll often see connected with him. The most evil man ever, the wickedest man alive.
Well, didn't the media give him that name?
Right, the British press coined, in fact, I think in particular, one press member, the name of Horatio Bottomley, gave him the name the wickedest man alive. And it's one of those things that Crowley sort of perversely took pride in. He kind of latched on to it. It's part of from my way of looking at it, it was part of a persona that he deliberately cultivated. But it was also a persona that, as time went on, became an increasing burden. Because, even though arguably he's not the arch-Satanist of the 20th century, and he's not really by much anybody's description a Satanist at all, and he's certainly not the wickedest. I mean, it's not saying he didn't have his degree of wickedness. Mm-hmm. But if you're looking at the 20th century, there are probably some more wicked people than he. But it was a name that stuck. It was something that stuck to him, and became a burden to get to not just his acceptability, but something that began to cloud everything. It obscured everything else that he did.
Mm-hmm. Can we start first? Can we kind of like give a little bit of background of? Okay, his real name was Edward Alexander Crowley, and he was
Edward Alexander Crowley. That's
right.
Always his name, actually. That is his legal name until the day he dies.
Wow. Oh, how did he get the name Aleister?
He adopted it.
But why? Why did he?
You could get a number of explanations on that. One would be, if you want to take the fancy occult explanation, it's because the letters in Aleister, by the way, is just a kind of stylized version of Alexander.
Oh.
That's all. Okay. It's arguably some sort of Celtic version of Alexander, but he in fact spelled his name in a particular way, and there's a numerological significance to it. The real reason he did it, I actually suspect, is that it sounded different. His father's name was Edward, all right?
Right.
So, while I don't think his father's middle name is Alexander, he's essentially named after his daddy, and therefore one way to distinguish himself from his father was to take a different name. Otherwise, it's like Big Eddie and Little Eddie.
Oh.
Well, but Edward Alexander Crowley is it's the name on his passports, for instance. His passports are never issued in the name of Aleister Crowley. He would take out, he might make tickets and do other things. It became, one way, Aleister Crowley was a kind of nom de plume that he adopted. It was, if you want to think of it in some way, it's almost the name of the character that he assumed. But to me, one of the things that's important to understand is that behind Aleister Crowley, this large, intimidating, wicked figure, there's always Edward Crowley. Edward Crowley never goes away. He's the man who's playing Aleister Crowley, or maybe after a while it's Aleister Crowley that's playing him. But there are always those sort of two sides to him. And that's one of the things that I began to look at him far more than his magic or anything else, really began to interest me about him in trying to figure out who this guy actually was and whether it's Edward or Aleister who's the more important of the two.
Now, he was born in England, in Warwickshire, England, on October 12th of 1875. And his parents were, they belonged to a Christian, they belonged to, they were strict brethren. And he wasn't allowed to play with any other children if the kids did not belong to that sect?
The Plymouth Brethren were, I don't know, they would probably have listeners who's run into them. If you want to think of something that was a good example of a very strict fire and brimstone Christian fundamentalist sect, that was it. That's what he grew up in. He grew up in what we would describe today as a strict Christian fundamentalist household. A small sect, which, as small sects sometimes do, believe that everybody else is going to hell except them. Mm-hmm. And that there was a very rigid approach to this. Now, that's one of those things that's not inconsequential. I mean, you've got this interesting thing here that seems to be ironic. Here's a guy who turns out to be an occultist who proclaims himself a prophet to replace Christianity, even, described again as the wickedest man in the world, the arch-Satanist, who's born and raised in a Christian fundamentalist household. And you might argue, well, there's a huge difference between, he must have rebelled against that, which he does. But here's a kind of interesting connection. The Crowley family, the family that he was part of, not just his father, but the whole sort of Crowley clan, made their money. They were quite well-to-do.
Yeah.
I mean, they weren't hugely rich, but they were well-to-do from the brewing industry.
Yeah.
They made Crowley ales. So his father got out of the brewing industry, but got out with, had a fair amount of money, used some of that to invest in what we now describe as real estate investments. But the family was well off. His father used his independent wealth, the fact that he didn't really have to work because of the income of the family and from his investments, to preach the gospel.
Yeah.
This was a man who wanted to devote himself. His father was a religious figure who wanted to devote himself to spreading the gospel, bringing more people into the sect.
Was he like a traveling preacher?
Not an itinerant preacher. I mean, but he would go from different places in addressing the different communities. But really saw himself. His father was a man who believed he had a spiritual calling. Now, the interesting thing is that little Eddie, Aleister, and the boy that would become Aleister, admired his father. He loved his father, and his father died, I think, when he was around 11,
right.
11 or 12. And this was a kind of very early tragic thing for him. He always mourned his father's death. He loved his dad. And in some way, if you sort of stand back and look at it, his father was a man who devoted his life to spreading the gospel, and his son, Aleister, was a man who devoted himself to spreading the gospel, if a very different one. There's a continuity in what he's doing. He comes out of this very religious, spiritual environment, and while he seems to repudiate that, on another level, he's just, in a way, sort of continuing in his father's footsteps.
So when the father dies, then all that inheritance and that money goes over to Aleister. Now,
goes to his mother first. His mom he has a very different relationship with his mother, and his relationship with his mother, I don't know. I mean, his biographers look at this in different ways. When I look at it, what I see is a guy who always mourned his father, mm-hmm. But on the other hand was always, and would do things to deliberately horrify his mother, yeah. But probably had some very complex psychological relationship with her. Oh. On the other hand, may have been always trying to get her approval.
But
maybe one of those things that sometimes that if you can't get someone's approval, then you will court their disapproval.
So is that what he did to her? And she gave him. She's the one that gave him the name, the Beast.
That's the story. Uh-huh. And we'd have to be. It's a good story. And since it's as good as explanation as any. He would do, or he claimed that he would do various mischievous, even sort of horrible things as a child to really just irritate his mother. And again, this isn't all that unusual. I think some people can can maybe identify that or know them. A boy that just goes out of his way to kind of torment his mother, and especially a mother who's very, very straight-laced and very a firm, unwavering believer in the faith, and a very narrow definition of appropriate behavior.
Now,
one way to look at it, is that what Aleister Crowley does his entire life is to do things to essentially anger his mother.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did he? Now, I read that he was hearing voices which would indicate he was a schizophrenic, and that he believed in reincarnation, and that he was a reincarnate of a magician, Eliphas Levi, who died before.
Levi, at one time or another, he seems to have claimed to be reincarnations of any number of people. The ones I can think of offhand, there was Levi. He claimed to be a reincarnation of Count Cagliostro, who was this 18th century sort of mystical figure in Paris.
Okay.
I think he claimed to be a reincarnation of Edward Kelly, who was this Elizabethan magician.
Oh, I didn't know all that.
and there are probably others as well.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, did he, how seriously did he meant that? I mean, there are probably people out there who argue he was absolutely serious about these things. I don't know. Sometimes I get the impression, my impression sometimes is that he would just sort of pop these things off the top of his head. Well, I mean, look, any of us can claim to be pretty much the reincarnation of anybody. I mean, who's going to argue with us?
Yeah.
I think what it meant is that he saw something in those figures that he identified with. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then could somehow, did he believe in reincarnation? Well, yes, he probably believed in a lot of things. Mm-hmm. Hearing voices, he believed he had, there were communications with the other world. I don't think the idea of hearing voices on his head in the way we'd normally think of that was something that was a part of it. On the whole, and again, I think you'd get different interpretations of this. So I'm just going to give you mine.
Okay.
He was a pretty, psychologically, in many ways, a pretty stable guy. I mean, there doesn't seem to be much. I think he generally had his wits about him. I think that much of what it was that he did was calculated. I mean, some of it was simply calculated to horrify people. Some of it was calculated to make a particular impression. But he's not a kind of loose cannon. Crowley he's well educated.
Yeah, he went
to...
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
He didn't graduate from Cambridge, but he attended Cambridge. He's kind of a college dropout. He was also, a couple of the things that sort of get lost about him and the whole idea of Crowley, the magician, and the occultist, is that he was a world-class chess player, and he also was a world-class mountaineer. Yeah. He was a guy who made some of the early expeditions into the Himalayas. One of the first people to make an attempt on the infamous K2.
Yeah. Did he ever make it?
I think there was a whole disaster that took place where members of the party died. It was one of those early things that that added to his negative reputation. The expedition, as these expeditions do, ran into bad weather. There were members who perished in it, and one of the things that he was later criticized for was not doing more to help them or going back for them.
That's right, I read that.
But then that's part of this still comes up today. This is one of the things that happen, because the rule in mountaineering, I'm not a mountaineer, but the rule in mountaineering is that you don't risk your life or the lives of other members of the expedition to go to try to retrieve bodies or save one who's in a hopeless position.
Right.
No, you fall off the trail into the crevasse, you're gone. Mm-hmm. And it's the expedition. So here's the whole idea was that yes, people had died, but the expedition goes on. And from the sort of rules of the kind of harsh rules of mountaineering, you might think of it, he was right. he was not. That was not really an action of callousness on his part that others wouldn't have accepted. But later on, this was brought up to show that, well, this is just what kind of a horrible guy that he is.
Now, from what I read, at the age of 24, he joined the Golden Dawn, a magical society.
Yeah, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Sometimes he gets credit for creating it. He doesn't. It had been around for years. He comes into it right at the end of the 19th century. Yeah, right about the beginning, 1899, 1900. And the Golden Dawn had been around, one form or another, since the late 1880s. There was a big revival of occult and esoteric organizations in the 1880s and 1870s. That the Theosophy appears in that period. A whole variety of organizations pop up all over Europe and America, and that was one of them. And it was one of these things that, in a lot of ways, it was connected to Rosicrucianism, and it was connected to mystical Freemasonry. I mean, to get into the Golden Dawn, theoretically, you had to advance through the higher esoteric degrees of Freemasonry, then you had to join the Rosicrucians, then you got into the Special Club, which was the Golden Dawn. And its doctrine was a combination of ritual magic and Kabbalah. It sort of incorporated everything. It was a kind of one-stop shopping center of mysticism. Go ahead.
No, well, is that when he started practicing the black arts and magic?
Well, that may go back a ways. I mean, there are a couple of things. If we sort of step back some years,
okay.
Remember he was at Cambridge,
right? And
one of the things that I found interesting in trying to piece together his career is that, again, his studies proceeded. I think he lost, but what he was aiming toward was a career in the diplomatic service, in the Foreign Office. So at one point, he was looking towards a career in government. In particular, he was interested to a potential posting to Russia. Now, that wasn't an easy thing to get, because, remember, we're talking about late Victorian British society, and to find your place in the Foreign Office took a certain amount of influence. And the thing is, he had that influence. One, he had remember, he doesn't come from an aristocratic family, not at all. He comes from a family with some money, but one of the people who was a great help to him through much of his life, all the way up until the 1920s, was his aunt, his Aunt Annie Crowley, who's his father, a paternal aunt, and she was a help to him. She was, in so many ways, that you could argue was sort of the mother that he wanted but never really had. She was this kind of substitute mother. She helped him financially. It was probably through her influence that he got into Cambridge in the first place. She was a member of a thing called the Primrose Society. And, that sounds like it's a garden club, but the Primrose Society was it was a political society. It was a kind of political action committee, women's auxiliary to some degree of the British Conservative Party, of the Tories. She was, with enough influence, she was able to help him get a place in the university. And through those same means, the idea of him eventually getting a place in Queen Victoria's or her successor's foreign service was a realistic goal. He might have achieved that, but it doesn't happen. He drops out, and he goes in a completely different direction. He goes in the direction of the spiritual seeker, of mysticism, and he recounts this incident that supposedly happened in Stockholm. And this is when he'd been sent on what he described as a kind of exploratory trip to Russia, or he was supposed to be on his way to Russia, and he'd obtained a passport. But then something happened, and this changed the whole trajectory of his life. And there's never any clear explanation, at least clear to me, of seeing as to what that might have been. And this supposedly was one of his first encounters, I guess is what we call, with the mystical. Mm-hmm. And what seems to have happened with Crowley, again, my take on it, and there certainly could be others, is that this was a fellow who had something happen to him that happens not to everyone, but happens to some people. He's touched by or has an encounter with what we could call the other world, the unseen world. You know, this realm where we rightly or wrongly believe all of these things from angels to demons dwell. And what happens every now and then, I mean, what permeates much of human history in a way, is that something reaches out of that world and it touches certain people. People have what we call mystical experiences. And those are, very individualized. Mm-hmm. And that changes them. It almost always does, because suddenly they've gotten this awareness that there's really something out there very different than what I had expected. And people react to this in a number of ways. Some people it frightens and repels. Some people it becomes a kind of curse that haunts them the rest of their life. Other people are inspired to chase this. It's like chasing a high in some way. That once you've been touched by this, you want to do that again. And that, to me, is what Crowley, rightly or wrongly, I mean, in terms of his approach, spent the rest of his life trying to do. He made this statement once, later in his life, that, the gods or the masters had sort of touched me. They touched me at one point, and I kept trying to get back to that point, and they spoke to me once, and then they never spoke to me again.
Okay, so in 1904, he supposedly, it was this book, the Book of Law, that was channeled through this Egyptian deity, and then were his other books also written through being a channeled through a spirit?
Well, the Book of the Law is for people who would consider them to be spiritual themselves, followers of Crowley. I think it's probably fair to say that's kind of their Bible. That is the primary holy work, or the chief reference in that. Anybody who wants to follow Crowley in a religious sense needs to read the Book of the Law. And that was, today we'd argue it was channeled. It was channeled by his wife. Okay.
Wait a minute. Hey, what do you mean? Channeled by his wife?
By his wife, Rose. Okay.
No way.
Married.
No.
He marries a woman, Rose Kelly, again from a good family, and they're off in Cairo, and she's the kind of medium. She's the one that this is channeled through. And, he sort of copies it down, and the being who is speaking to him is called Aiwass, Aiwass, and there are various interpretations of who or what Aiwass was. He decides it's one of the Egyptian gods, or it's a spirit, which, this is one of those things. If it's, the spirit's going to talk to you, then, and this is why he thought he was in the sort of path of becoming a prophet, because, an angel, the angel Gabriel had spoken to Muhammad. The Moroni speaks to Joseph Smith. I mean, angels throughout, this is one of the sort of signs that you have been chosen, right? When some mystical being decides to give you the new source. So he thought that this new law, this new dispensation, was being delivered him through the medium of his young wife. The marriage, needless to say, does not last much longer. They eventually split up and divorce. She becomes an alcoholic, basically. She turns to drink. They have a daughter who dies in infancy. Something which he takes very hard. I mean, that's one of those things that he never quite gets over that, and he believes that his wife was irresponsible, and there's a whole story she was sort of, and that's really sort of the end of the whole relationship.
Now, Rick, did she die? I read that she died in a I read that he has this whole thing with women, that they either end up in a mental institution or they commit suicide. They do end up being alcoholics or drug addicts. Is that true in all your research?
I would say that probably, he had a lot of female companions. Okay, there's always, a new girlfriend sort of on the horizon, and some wives in the process as well. And there are, I think Rose is, arguably goes off her rails for a while. Later on in the 20s, he marries a woman, I think a Nicaraguan, and she's committed. He has her committed to Colney Hatch, which is a mental hospital, and others like
there was Nellie.
Do become drug addicts. He becomes a heroin addict himself. The question about that is whether or not it's there. So these were perfectly happy, well-adjusted young women who were totally fine until they met this awful guy, and he drove them off the rails. Okay, that he drove them to drug rancor into the loony bin, or whether the women who were attracted to him to begin with were maybe halfway there to begin with. And I think you would have to look at that on a kind of case-by-case basis. It's kind of tempting to argue that this was a guy. I mean, look, he was able to continually attract. I mean, well past what one might have thought his period of attractiveness. He didn't have a problem finding women who were attracted to him. He certainly had a problem of keeping them attached for generally any period of time. He definitely was a difficult man to live with in a lot of ways. He was very demanding. I think you could, if you, people who were interested in this would have to look at, I think any of his biographies go into this. He could treat women and, men too, horribly. He was not he was a difficult person to be a friend of. Yeah. He burned, most of the people who passed through his life, who at some point had called him a friend, came to avoid or disdain him. He kept the friendship of a relatively small number of people. He drove most people away from him. He was demanding in a number of ways, and especially in his female companions. Was he might have driven some of them over the rails, but most of them had their demons to begin with.
Now, I read that he was an open bisexual sex magician.
Bisexual sex. Well,
yeah.
He definitely practiced sex magic, which isn't. And here again, just in case I haven't, but in terms of what I understand about it, it's not nearly as sexy as it sounds. All right. Sex magic is all about, a very quick, I guess, very simplistic explanation is that sex magic is the idea that one can use sexual acts and the energy which is brought up during them to be channeled for spiritual purposes. So in other words, it's not really about the pleasure, or it's not really about any sort of 50 Shades of Grey, sadomasochistic, kinky stuff. It's all about using sexes to sort of generate energy to use from other sources, which to me sounds like trying to do it and think about baseball scores at the same time. It's one of those things that apparently is a lot of work.
Well, I read that because he was in the Victorian time, that if what he was doing then was doing now in present day, it wouldn't be that horrific or whatever.
Well, probably some of the sex magic rituals would still today probably freak out most people. Saw them.
They said also,
but again, it's not necessarily exciting as probably one would assume. It was all very ritualized, and it was all for some purpose, and basically the woman in that is kind of a prop. The bisexual aspect of it, there certainly was that element. I mean, Crowley did have sex with men from time to time. His general interest seems to have been towards women. I mean, that's what his relationships were normally. I think that he was, I wouldn't quite say, he was certainly open to homosexuality. It also, within sex magic, had a particular ritual purpose. I mean, there were certain rituals that required homosexual acts to be part of those, and one had to be part of it. Drugs were often involved in that as well. It doesn't seem to have been his primary interest, but it was certainly there. I mean, this is, Crowley prided himself as a man who broke taboos. And I think he was one of those things that if conventional morality said you couldn't do something, well, then he was going to do it, just in some ways to say that he had done it.
Yeah, very immoral. And he did take a lot of drugs, several different kind of drugs.
He was kind of a pioneer in recreational drug taking. I mean, he wasn't the only person. I mean, he didn't invent this. He did become, and certainly by the 1920s, I mean, for the latter part of his life, he was a heroin addict.
Oh.
And he tried to kick it, and on various occasions. But in his last years, I mean, when he died, he had a huge habit. And he was actually registered in Britain as a hopeless addict.
Oh,
and that you could then get a pharmacist to, it was like on your health plan, and that way, but you could actually get legal heroin, or you could get it legally because of the idea that you were simply an addict, and I don't know, I think towards the end he was taking enough heroin daily probably to kill most other people.
Oh,
but the way he got into that, the reason that he began taking heroin as opposed to some other drugs, heroin really wasn't a ritual drug. That wasn't something that he took for magical purposes. He took it initially as a treatment for asthma.
Yes.
He was asthmatic as a child, and one of the things that I guess, heroin will relieve is asthma.
I read that.
But, there's a catch to that, and that's that you become an addict. So, and that would, it's one of the things is that when he would go off of heroin, the asthma would return, and that means the feeling of suffocating, and so he would go back on it.
Damn.
The other drugs that he used for ritual purposes, I mean, so let's put it this way, for him, in a way, heroin was a kind of medicine. It was a kind of perverse medicine, but that was essentially why he gravitated there. The other drugs he used were things like ether, which at one point I didn't really realize people use as a drug, but it's like pumping gasoline a little more.
Oh my God!
But ether, yeah, you put ether on a rag and you would breathe it and you would get high.
Oh.
So when he was in the U.S. during the First World War, he was constantly trying to get ether. That was like his drug of choice, and he would hole up in a hotel room in New Orleans with a bottle of ether and a rag, and have a really fun weekend.
God. So what the heck does ether do for you? Does it knock you out?
I haven't tried it that way. The only time.
Come on, Rick.
That I just know it's an anesthetic that if you take enough of it will knock you out.
Yeah.
But I guess it's like with a lot of things, between before you become totally unconscious, it takes you into another mental state.
Oh
it got him high. It brought him to, and he believed, as you will find many people believe, that one of the things that different type of drugs do is that they induce mental states that then open you up to the spiritual realm or make you,
that's
more accessible, or just more fun at parties.
Okay, well that goes along with him. That certainly goes along with him. Oh.
But the other drug that he really was a kind of pioneer for was with mescalin.
I didn't hear that.
Psychedelic. And peyote, but essentially, pharmaceutical grade peyote.
And he was able to get all this in those days?
Well, yes, because most of this stuff is legal. Okay? Early on, really until you get to the 20s, there's a time when cocaine, this is where, the term Coca-Cola comes from, because when it was first brewed, it actually had coca extract in it. When they said it was the pause that refreshes, they weren't really kidding. And then, it's not until really just before and after the First World War in the 20s that greater, the kind of drug restrictions that we think of as normal today began to come in. Opium, for instance. There was an old, you can still see this in Western, laudanum. You ever hear about people drinking laudanum, which was this kind of patent medicine? You could just go in and buy it over the counter. It was an over-the-counter
I never heard
medicine.
of that.
Laudanum, well, you read of it, I know, maybe, Little House on the Prairie books, I think, probably mentioned laudanum somewhere. It was a very common over-the-counter medicine that was given. You'd use it to calm children, all kinds of ills. But what laudanum was basically opium syrup. It was a syrup that contained a tincture of opium, and it would calm you down. And it was used for a whole variety of things. So these drugs were sort of readily available. And what happened was that peyote was nobody had really heard of it, and it was synthesized and sort of then turned into mescalin in a synthetic form. And again, when he was in the U.S., in the United States, during the First World War, I think 1915, 1916, he's going on a road trip across the United States. He's leaving New York, and he's headed for San Francisco, and he's going to make this huge circuit around America. And one of the things he wants to do on the way is he wants to carry out various ritual actions. He's going to have some of them sex magic, some of them not, at various places. And he believes that this drug that some years before, he'd encountered in Mexico, some years before he first tried it, he believed that this had great spiritual effectiveness. So he found out that an American pharmaceutical lab in Detroit, I think, Park Davis Labs, maybe somebody may have heard of these, Park Davis Pharmaceuticals had synthesized this, and he basically went through and, bought like a pound of it. Okay, he went through and he went to the lab, bought the synthesized stuff, you could simply buy it, there were no restrictions on it, and he used that for some time. Was quite experimental with it. He would invite people over for dinner, and he would fix them curries or other sort of more exotic meals. Curry apparently is good with sort of covering up the taste of things. So if anybody invites you for curry, keep that in mind. But, and then he would put various doses of mescaline, sometimes other drugs in it. Sometimes he would eat it, sometimes he wouldn't. In other cases, what he would do is that he would dose his guests with the drugs, and then he would sit back and take notes on the effects.
Oh my God, I never heard that before.
So what he was doing was sort of using his dinner guests as guinea pigs to see, try different doses and then see what kind of effects that you would have.
So what were the effects?
Well, I suppose you would have had to have been there.
Oh.
You get, there are different effects, certainly, between when people know they're taking a drug and when they have no idea they've taken a drug. Mm-hmm. And because, people, if somebody, dropped acid, they know what they're doing, and they have some, and if they've done it before, they have an expectation of the effect, and they're sort of prepared for that. They're sort of waiting for these things to happen. I've certainly heard of cases where people would be given drugs, they didn't know they were given it, and they didn't seem to notice anything. Since they didn't know anything was supposed to happen, they didn't know anything was happening. In other cases, apparently, what would you assume, if you were having an acid trip, but you didn't know that you were having an acid trip, what you would assume you were assuming you're having a really bad day, or that you'd eaten something, or something. I mean, that would be part of the idea. How would they respond? What would happen? Yeah, and the other interesting things, how do they become more open to ideas? How does it affect them mentally? There's almost a kind of laboratory experiment which is being done in that case, and because Crowley always, among other things, always saw himself as a scholar and a bit of a scientist as well. I mean, from his standpoint, occultism was a form of science.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about? I read that he was into human sacrifice and animal sacrifice.
Well, that's okay. One of the things the story you'll often hear is that he was involved in a child. There's even a story that he was involved in some evocation of a demon or the god Pan, and he sacrificed one of his own children. Nothing like that ever happened. He had one son, who was, born out of wedlock to a woman he wasn't married to, but that's the only child. He did have, a daughter, I think at least a couple of children who died in infancy. Those were terrible experiences for him. I mean, there was no sacrifice which was involved in that. And I know that, what it may sound like is that I'm constantly saying that he was really this kind of wonderful guy and they didn't do these things, and that's not it. He had horrible, horrible flaws. But it's part of it's part of the mythology that he created about himself in many ways, and he probably told people. He certainly liked to imply on occasions that he'd been part of human sacrifice. And one explanation he talked about, that thousands, and I think times he'd been somehow involved in the sacrifice of thousands of innocents. And actually, what he was referring to in that case was, not to be too indelicate about it, he was referring to masturbation, ritual masturbation.
Oh, I didn't know that.
That was then the sort of sacrifice of all these, not real children, but I guess in some way potential ones. That those were, it's kind of the lower end of sex magic, I suppose. But he liked to cultivate that kind of image. And is this to say that he was never participated in a human sacrifice? I don't know. Could have happened.
What about animal sacrifice?
There might have been some evening he would have been up for that. But probably not.
What about animal sacrifice?
Animal sacrifices, there may well have been. He almost certainly saw them and participated. I don't think it was a regular type of thing.
Oh God! All right, well, what about the Abbey? He went to Sicily and he bought this mansion. I guess it was called the Santa Barbara, but it really wasn't a mansion. It was a small house, and he names it Abbey Thelema.
Yeah, in Thelema, the Abbey of Thelema. Thelema was sort of his. It comes from this Greek word for will, and that was the name of Thelema. Is sort of his religion. What he bought was a kind of rundown farmhouse near a place called Cefalù on the north coast of Sicily. Right. And really, if you looked at it some decades later, today we'd call this closer to a commune, because that's what it was, because everybody was going to come there and hang out and take drugs and try to access the other side. And, and was there a lot of drugs and free love going on? Yeah, but again, probably if you were there, it wouldn't be nearly as interesting as one might imagine. The problem with it was that the water was bad. And in fact, he warned people there to avoid drinking the local water because of the contamination. One fellow, a guy named Raoul Loveday, one of a British friend or follower went there, died, I think, of typhoid. And then that becomes all kinds of stories that that Crowley sacrificed him, that this was a human sacrifice. The guy basically died of typhoid poisoning.
That's okay. So supposedly, what was going on? These are the tales of the Abbey, that orgies and drugs and bestiality and animal sacrifice and even human sacrifice were going on at this Abbey.
the animal. You mentioned animal. I can think of a couple. As a kid, he once argued that he had killed a cat.
Yes,
there are different stories, and he did later on as an adult. On a sort of spiritual ether binge in the woods of New Hampshire, he crucified a frog.
Oh, poor thing.
So, well, that's what he said. I mean, and we'll take his word for it that that's what he did. So, animal sacrifice figures in here. It's not something that he got up every morning and decided he would go kill a kitten.
Don't say that.
But I think it was something that would be engaged in, or it's also one of those things that would horrify people, and therefore it's one of the things that gets... I mean, the thing with Crowley is that, to me, I always wonder how much of this is sort of put on. How much of it is affectation? Am I really doing these horrible things, or am I going to give the impression I'm doing these horrible things?
And that's what he wanted, right? He wanted all these stories to be told about him because it gave him publicity, right?
Giving publicity, if you can't be famous, be infamous.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And it gets you. But it's also the other way of sort of making it. It's like developing a reputation for being a tough guy. So if you want to get a reputation for being a tough guy, being a bad character, you spread stories about how you've beaten people up. You spread stories about, how tough you are. You spread stories about killing people. All right. I mean, here's one way to think it. One of the most common thing. Well, this is probably much more common particularly among the male aspect of the population, is that some people, arguably, some guys tend to exaggerate their sexual exploits.
Oh.
All right?
Yeah.
Maybe it happened, but maybe it didn't quite happen that way, or as many times, or as many, okay. So, but part of that is that, one needs to create a certain, you want to create a certain image about yourself and so on. And so, if you can't add that to your resume, you'll pad it in some way. It's the old thing, I guess, of resume padding. To create an impression of something. And I'm not saying here that Crowley is a complete fraud. I mean, I think he's deadly earnest about a lot of things. But there's a real sort of, I think he's perfectly willing, just in the way that this was a guy who he never outgrew doing things to horrify his mother. And it went from doing things to horrifying his mother to doing things to horrifying people that he thought were stick in the mud, the people that he thought were prudes, to society as a whole. I mean, one of the things that he does is that he's just sort of giving a big middle finger to establish society and mores. And he enjoyed doing that. Some people do. You can find that it's nothing, they really enjoy sort of doing this. But there is a cost for it. Eventually you make yourself a kind of pariah. Sooner or later people quit inviting you to the parties if you're fearsome enough. And that, I think, is why by the 1930s, as he's towards the latter part of his life, when he would then, in some ways, try to get people to listen to him, and he actually tries this effort to sort of, a very unsuccessful effort to repair his reputation in the early 30s, he finds out he can't. Because this whole image that he'd created, and that he'd allowed to be created, was now stuck to him like glue. He wasn't going to be able to get it off.
Wow, I didn't know that. Okay, so this was now when he had been there for 4 years, and then Mussolini made him leave, kicked him out of there?
Mussolini, the Italian fascist government that had come to power, in fact, in early 23, they kick him out. They actually don't kick the whole colony out. They specifically target him. He has to leave. Which is one of those things that sort of, interesting, because it was, the other ones could sort of, the colony sort of fell apart without him. And, but again, the Abbey of Thelema, the farmhouse, the commune was, there were lots of problems. The water was bad, the food was bad, people came and went. It the people would come there as a kind of spiritual pilgrimage. I mean, he did have some kind of pull. The Italians wanted him out of there. I think because they suspected that he was up to something else. I mean, part of it was that, remember, this is in Sicily, and this is a rural area full of traditional Roman Catholic peasants and townspeople, and what he's getting, this is this kind of weirdo Englishman who comes in and sets up some sort of free love and drugs commune for foreigners, okay? So no, they're not popular. Nobody around there is terribly glad to have them around, and there are lots of complaints about them. But he seems to have been specifically targeted because there was first of all, I think there were inklings of his connection to the British government and intelligence at that point in time, and that, Cefalu, where he wasn't exactly a place to, develop an espionage base, but it may have been a sort of way station for information. There are also various documents left lying around that the Italians later picked up that show that he was having communication with British officials, which was kind of interesting because you wouldn't assume that any British official would have anything to do with this guy.
Yeah.
But they do. That's the thing, is that even if they want to wash their hands afterwards, if they never want to acknowledge it, they do repeatedly sort of reluctantly bring him in. But after he's kicked out of Sicily, he really goes into a kind of downward spiral. And 23 and 24 and 20, the mid-20s are really a low point. He goes back on heroin. He's out of money. Whatever sort of residual money he'd had long ago been spent. He and his Scarlet Woman, his sort of spiritual mate girlfriend of the moment, are he forces her into prostitution.
Is that Nellie O'Hara?
No. I'm trying to think it's Leah Hersig, but I may be thinking.
Oh, that's the one. She's the one that was helping him run the Abbey.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got a picture of her. Yeah, she's the one that was helping him run, and she said she would do anything. She would prostitute, she would do anything.
Yeah, and well, eventually he's so sick that he can't really move, and so she goes out on the streets. I mean, that's why I said that he's not necessarily a good boyfriend. And eventually, he eventually sort of draws himself out of that. By the end of the 20s, he's begun to recover. But there's an episode I think that happens, and this is again around 23, 24. I think it's after he's out of Sicily, and there are a couple of people in the fringes of British intelligence, and a question comes in about, they're talking about secret societies and sort of what they call Asiatic evil, and whether there are some sort of occult activities among different groups in India and the Far East, and basically one person says to another one is that, well, I don't know much about that, but I know a guy who probably would know, and it's Aleister Crowley. And there's always they almost apologize for mentioning his name, and not that I would recommend him in any way, but if you wanted to discuss that, then he's the person you would probably turn to. Which shows that even in this period, even though his name is not greeted with enthusiasm in most cases, he's still this kind of known quantity, and in certain circumstances, he's a kind of go-to guy. And this is one of the things you would constantly find is that, well, people publicly would never kind of acknowledge any connection to him. This is, you would never want to be seen with him in public. Well, in private, you might have a question to ask him. And he was a man who, let's put it this way, as bad as he was, as negative as his reputation was, Crowley, like other people, had his uses. And this is the question here. It isn't whether or not you like him. It isn't whether or not you trust him. It's whether or not you can make use of him in a particular situation.
And they did.
Yeah.
Now, as far as dates go, what was the date? That was between 1914 and 1918?
The date for what?
For Crowley with the British intelligence.
Well, that seems to be one of those things that's kind of on again, off again throughout much of his career. The main episode of that, I mean, I'll tell you how I got interested in the whole thing. Is that one of the things that I do in terms of my research is, I didn't really start out aiming at this guy. I'm interested in sort of the history of intelligence, and I'm interested in, various sort of spies and other people of that sort. I don't know how I got onto it, but it's a habit. So what I was doing is I was actually looking for other people, other spies that have nothing to do with this, in and around New York during the First World War. And what I came across was that, Aleister Crowley's in there in the same period, and there, at various points he'd sort of claimed, which nobody took seriously, that he'd been connected to British intelligence. And I thought, maybe I should just sort of look into that. Maybe there's something there. So it was just kind of an offhand thing. So I sent off, through the Freedom of Information Act, to see whether or not in the FBI files there was anything on him. And there's some sort of early file. I mean, this is even before it was the FBI, when it was just the BI, the Bureau of Investigation.
Oh.
And it showed up, and this little file sort of showed up, and then there was also, the other thing I found was that there was another sort of American intelligence agency at that time called the Military Intelligence Division, the MID. Now that no longer exists, but it's, not in that form. So the MID, during the First World War, when the U.S. entered it, was also involved in a lot of sort of, what we think of as homeland security stuff today. They were involved in looking for potential German agents. Well, the thing is that Crowley, who spent all of World War I in the U.S., all right? So he arrived in America on Halloween. I always think it's interesting. He arrived on October 31st, 1914, just not long after the war started. So got on a boat, came over to her, and he was here until the end of 1919. So actually well after, almost a year after the year the war was over. So he spent all of the war years, the whole of the First World War. And remember, during much of that, the U.S. was a neutral country. The United States, the war begins in 1914. The United States doesn't join until 1917. So he arrives in an America which is a neutral country, in which there are German and Allied agents both at work, both trying to sway American public opinion. One of the things that the British really want to do, and they do really want to do this, is to bring America into the war. Mm-hmm. And that works out that way. And that's one of the things that Crowley later claimed that he in some way had something to do with. He was always saying that, so he comes over in October 1914, and what he does very quickly is that he doesn't associate with British agents. No, he becomes buddy-buddy with German propagandists. And he goes to work for a magazine called The Fatherland. Okay, guess what? That's a pro-German magazine published by a guy named George Sylvester Viereck, who is a German agent and propagandist. And Crowley just somehow managed to get into this whole crowd of German agents and propagandists and their whole espionage and sabotage system. And he wins their confidence by writing blatantly, really scurrilous anti-British propaganda for this pro-German publication. All right, now keep in mind, he is a Englishman, a British citizen. He pretends to be an Irish dissident. Okay? So he pretends, he's claiming that, I'm doing this because suddenly I've become this Irish nationalist. Well, he's not Irish. I don't think he's even been to Ireland. He has no credentials. The only people who would possibly believe that he was an Irish nationalist were the Germans. So he sort of fools all these guys, but he's right. He really writes. He writes nasty things about England. He writes nasty things about the king. All kinds of stuff. Now, one of the things you might be wondering, were there people back in England that noticed that he was writing this? Oh, yes, there were. And in fact, this leads one British newspaper towards the end of the war, right after it, to declare that Crowley is a traitor and a man who ought to be hanged. So the press had caught on to this. And this is another thing. This is one of those things that he would never be able to live down because, think about it. He was a little too old for regular military service when the war broke out, although he might have become an officer. Here's a guy who leaves the country when the war starts out, spends the whole war, when remember, tens of thousands of Englishmen are dying. We'll lose almost 1 million men in this war. He spends the whole war in America running around, taking drugs, engaging in all kinds of disgusting, sex magic acts and God knows what else, not serving his country, and worse than that, he's not just a slacker. This guy is a traitor. He befriends German agents, and he writes propaganda against his own country. Now, you might have assumed that when he would then come back to England after the war, what would you assume would happen to him?
He'd be arrested.
He'd be arrested. Something would happen to him.
Yeah.
Nothing happens to him. Not a thing.
And why is that?
Well, that's an interesting question. So that was one of the things that, in looking through this military intelligence division file, remember, Crowley's hanging around with Germans, and now the Americans are in the war, so what do they become very suspicious of? Anybody who'd been involved in German propaganda, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're going to take an interest in this guy. So, they do take an interest in him, and they begin compiling a file on him, and there's even some discussion between the New York State Attorney General and other American officials that let's arrest him, because this is a guy who looks to us like an enemy agent. Why? Because he was friends with other people we've arrested, and he wrote anti-British propaganda. Well, they're going to do this, but then there's one document in that file that changed everything. And as the Americans were beginning to collect this information, they made an inquiry about him to the British Consulate General in New York. And the Consulate General basically says that Mr. Crowley is working for us. He is an employee of His Majesty's government, and we are aware of what he is doing. And basically, don't touch him.
Oh my God.
Now, what that meant, in a way, is that Crowley, in later years, especially when people would argue, you're a horrible, horrible person and a traitor and you're not a good Englishman, he would go, no, you don't understand. During the war, I was really, even though I was writing this German propaganda, but it was all phony stuff. And I was really working for England the whole time.
Mm.
And nobody really much believed this, and there wasn't any good reason to believe it. The assumption was that this is a man who would lie about anything. This is a coward and a traitor who's now trying to pretend he was some sort of patriot. Well, the one thing about that is an indication that he wasn't lying. It doesn't define exactly what it was he was doing, but he's in their employ. So what he was saying about himself was essentially correct. So that's what really began me. This eventually, I wrote a little article about that. I sort of took it and I wrote an article that said, hey, this is kind of interesting. Look what I found. Mm. And that article, you know what people did with that article?
No.
They sort of pirated it and they published it all over the internet.
They didn't.
Well, it's okay because, for academic articles, people don't get paid. Just might bring that up.
Oh.
If people think that university professors get big bucks for all these things they write in academic journals, you don't. You don't get a penny.
Oh, that's too bad.
So it didn't really matter. Well, we just, that's just what we do. But at any rate, it got spread around, and then I would start getting, letters and then, emails from people going, well, this is very interesting, and then some people go, I have this little bit of information, and you should really follow this further. So what I eventually did was I got completely diverted from another book I was working on, and then I began taking that article and looking for it. And the whole idea was that, okay, let's look at it this way. Crowley had some connection to, British Secret Service operator. He was doing something for the British government in wartime America. So let's look at his other statements. I mean, let's give him the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume that when he says, I did this or that he might actually been doing it. And let's go back and look at his whole career and his associations and the people he knew and where he was and how that might have some connection to intelligence operations. And boy, once you begin doing that, a whole series of connections through his entire career, he's constantly in the company or dealing with or running across people who have intelligence connections. Way too much for it to be a coincidence. So, well, he's not, well, you can't say that he's an asset. He's someone that people within branches of British intelligence at certain times, in certain situations, will use as a go-to guy. I don't think most of them ever particularly, I mean, he had some friends in that, but most of them weren't, they certainly weren't his followers. They might have found him personally abhorrent, but he was, in those situations, useful. And in the same way that they found him useful, the way he could get the confidence of the Germans in New York in 1914 and 1915 was because of his connections previously with German occultists in Europe.
Now,
go ahead and ask me another question.
Oh, no. Now, what was his connection with the Lusitania?
Well, the Lusitania is one of those... the Lusitania is one of those things that in the book, editors want you to pump things up, and it wasn't one of those things that I was going to make as big a part of the story out of as possible. But people remember the name of the Lusitania. Well, his first connection with the Lusitania is, remember I said that he showed up in America on Halloween 1914?
Oh, yes.
He showed up on the Lusitania.
That's right.
Okay. But, the Lusitania was one of the major liners on the Atlantic route, and so, lots of people came over on the Lusitania. So he showed up in the fall of 1914, and the Lusitania is then torpedoed and sunk by a U-boat off the coast of Ireland in May 1915. So it makes several trips back and forth between. The Lusitania was one of those things that was the Lusitania was a symbol of British maritime power. It was one of the more modern, one of the biggest of the British liners, and therefore the British also made this, early on in the war they decided they were going to take liners and turn them into auxiliary warships. So they briefly designated an auxiliary cruiser, and were actually going to mount guns on it. They eventually decided that wasn't a good idea because it was just too slow and too big of a target. And but what they did do is that they used it to carry war supplies and munitions. So they would use it to carry unassembled shells or assembled shells. Every trip it made from America. So the British were buying all kinds of war material in America. Again, America was a neutral country, so they put out contracts for bullets, rifles, explosives, and the Lusitania had large cargo holds, and so in addition to its passengers, every time it went back across the Atlantic, it was carrying war supplies. The Germans know this. And one of the things that did, of course, is that when you take a ship, even a passenger ship, and you put war material on it, during wartime, it makes it a legitimate target. And that's why the Germans torpedoed it. So they torpedoed it to destroy a symbol of British power. They torpedoed it because the British themselves were violating the laws of what you do with passenger ships in terms of using it to carry war supplies. Crowley knew, because of his acquaintance, he's dealing with sort of the cadre of German propagandists and others in New York, that the Lusitania, that getting the Lusitania was something that they were interested in. And it's even one of those things that he took some credit for encouraging, that this is something that you should do. That this would really sort of teach them a lesson in some way. Now, that actually gets into this whole thing, which is, people might want to look into in their own, but there's a whole cottage industry of conspiracy theories about the Lusitania. And common of them, what it boils down to is that the Germans, were eager to sink the Lusitania, but that was kind of a hard thing to do, because even though it's a big ship, the thing with U-boats, they're not like Wolfpack U-boats in World War II. In World War I, U-boats are operated individually, and pretty much for a U-boat to be able to sink a ship, it just had to sort of be in the right place where that ship appeared. So this is why, the German subs would sort of haunt sea lanes where they expected ships to come up. But the Lusitania, it's bad luck. Because what happened is that they just had to be in the right spot at a particular time on a particular day when the U-20 was going to be there as well. So there's an argument to be made that it is the British themselves, the British Admiralty, who set up the Lusitania to be sunk. That they make it a sacrificial lamb. That they want this to happen because they realize that to do so will then be a black eye for the Germans. This will enrage American opinion and possibly bring the Americans into the war. Now, the sinking of the Lusitania doesn't bring the U.S. into the war, but it's a big step in that direction.
There were a lot of... Go ahead.
Yeah, there were about 100 Americans on board.
But there were wealthy... Were the Rockefellers on there? And there were a lot of...
I don't think there were any Rockefellers. I mean, not that I can think of. But there were enough people that it was noticed. There are, I think, 120 some odd Americans die that go down with the ship. Of course, the ship also sunk a lot faster than anybody expected. Partly because the cargo it was carrying blew up. Or at least that's one idea. I mean, there were internal explosions that made the ship go down much quicker than would have been assumed. But it was one of those things that. So this is where you look at it. Okay, is Crowley just later on, with his sort of devilish boastfulness, trying to claim credit for something he had nothing to do with, or did he play some greater or lesser role in sort of maneuvering this situation to happen? And, it's one of those things, you can either sort of take his word for it, which, why should one necessarily do that? It's something that you have to treat as a possibility. It's one of those things that I often, tell students in history classes when I really want to confuse them is, one of the ideas that a lot of people have when they study history or they take a history class is that, there's some huge black book somewhere that's got everything that ever happened written down in it, right? Because we know everything that ever happened, and it's just, it's not like that at all. We know most of what happened. We have no idea. Okay? A lot of things that we think happened never did or never happened in the form they have. Much of what we take for historical knowledge is kind of a combination of hearsay and myth and wishful thinking. So, the genuine answer to most questions, historical or otherwise, is maybe.
Interesting.
That's one of the things to always consider is that the most important question, the answer to the questions in life is not yes or no, but maybe. Because most of them you can never absolutely definitively answer.
Wow.
So one of the things that you have to do in this, it's like a criminal investigation. What do? You collect the evidence and you see which way the evidence leads you. And you put that evidence together and you see what it looks like. And then you see whether or not you could get a DA to prosecute on it. And that in many ways is, in the stuff that I work on, I think the things that a lot of historians do is that we're, it's going to make it sound a lot sexier than it actually is, but you're sort of detectives. You're going back, you're sorting through evidence, you're looking at different statements, you're measuring the contradictions, you're trying to judge who's more believable, who has a reason to tell the truth, who has a reason to lie. You look at what people do as opposed to what they say. You put all of this evidence together and you make a case.
Mm-hmm. And this book took you 4 years to write, correct?
Actually for a book that's probably from the time I first wrote the article to the book. The book, itself came out, there's always this endless series of collecting data. One of the things about doing research on a topic, if you work it right, you can research it forever.
Okay, you know what? I want to move forward again because I've got a question to ask you, but I can't ask you yet until we go over this. When he was kicked out of the Abbey, when Mussolini kicked him out of the Abbey, he had nowhere to go. So I read that he went to a friend's house. He was invited in by a friend in France.
Oh, you're talking about Gurdjieff?
No, Frank Harris.
The Russian mystic.
No, Frank Harris who was a successful publisher.
Frank Harris. Yeah, he did go to see Frank Harris. I think Frank Harris gave him money.
Didn't he?
Remember, at this point in his life, Crowley's essentially kind of bumming off friends.
Right, he had squandered all his money, so this Frank Harris invited him to come. Did he? I guess he lived with them. I don't know. But it was a friend of his who was a successful publisher and playwright.
Yeah, Frank Harris had known Crowley in America. Frank Harris had also sort of flirted with some German propagandists as well. Frank Harris had all kinds of interesting connections, but he was a journalist, kind of avant-garde journalist, and Crowley sort of showed up, needed a place to stay, a place to crash, needed some money and probably a good meal, and I think he probably wore out his welcome pretty quickly, as he often did. But that was, this is a period again when Crowley's really sort of down on his luck. He's like one step away from being a street person.
All right, then he wanted to marry this woman. She was an American adventurer, Nellie O'Hara, but the second wife that he was married to wouldn't give him a divorce, so they ended up living together as man and wife.
Yeah, he didn't have any real problem with that. But he's, his liaisons with women, and she had money. Okay, that sort of gets him out of. You can sort of see the pattern here. He's down and out, and now he finds a kind of rich American woman, reasonably rich American woman that he can, sponge off of, and give a certain degree of spiritual enlightenment to as well.
All right.
And, are you going to ask me in this period the thing about because someone is bound to bring this up?
Okay. No, don't go there yet.
Oh, we do. You don't want to go there yet?
No, okay. No. Okay. So then he meets up with this Nellie O'Hara, and she is friends with Pauline Pierce, and she's in France. I guess. Okay, so she's in France. So being Crowley, who is this immoral guy, I guess he sleeps with men and women and threesomes and whatever. They think that he probably got her pregnant. She came back from France. She left France and went back home, and she was married. Was married to a Marvin Pierce.
Well.
Okay, wait a minute.
Okay,
and so
ahead.
then.
Okay.
and so then she returns to America in 1924, and then on June of 1925 she gives birth to a little girl, and she named it Barbara. Now, do you know where I'm going? Do you know where I'm going with that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you want to go ahead and do the story?
Well, it was when I was on Coast to Coast, there was somebody who called in and they asked me about is Barbara Bush, do you know about Barbara Bush being Aleister Crowley's daughter?
Yeah.
And I had to say no, because that was the first I'd ever heard of it. I had not run across. I had to go, well, that's a new one.
So you didn't
It's a great story, but I think that it's one of those things that, and not try to rain on great stories, but I think it's a story.
Real now, because this Nellie was good friends with this Pauline Pierce.
Well, okay, she's I went back, this type of thing is going to make me curious, so I'm going to have to figure out,
Oh, please.
So I went back and looked at it to see. She does go over, she is in Paris at the same time he is in Paris.
Right.
All right? They did overlap in that period.
And she's good friends with Nellie.
Is there anything else I could find to ever put him and her in the same place at the same time? No.
Well, wait a minute. If she's friends, if this Pauline Pierce is a good friend to Nellie, why wouldn't they have been together?
They might have been, but I'm not sure that he was that close to, because I think part of it is that they're confusing Nellie O'Hara with someone else. Okay, there's an American that he's with in that period, but he runs across her. I mean, yeah, who am I to say that it's impossible? Okay, I mean, could he have been Barbara Bush's dad? He could have been. But I challenge that but the other thing I'd say is that so could probably about 500,000 other men in Paris in the same period.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, it's one of those things, but it's.
Oh God! When I read that, I thought, oh my God.
What it seems to be largely based on, and this, I'll go along with. Barbara Bush, as she got older, kind of looks like Aleister Crowley.
Oh, do you think so? I have a picture of them.
I don't know. When somebody told me that, then I can imagine that there was a resemblance between them. But then there's Michael Chiklis, the actor, any number of people look like him. Any kind of bald guy, which is, Uncle Fester looked like Aleister.
Yeah,
I don't
you're
know if
right.
Remembers who Uncle Fester
he does.
But, from the Adam. But, Uncle Fester is sort of based upon this. So this is why, again, if particularly the older, bald, bullet-headed Aleister Crowley, whether you never recognized him, if you ever watched The Addams Family and Uncle Fester, you saw a cartoon version of Aleister Crowley.
Yeah.
So it doesn't surprise me somebody looks at Barbara Bush and goes, well, I don't know, if we took her hair off and made her bald-headed and a man, then she'd look kind of like Aleister Crowley. So, it could be, but, I think that's kind of, it's one of those things that we call apocryphal, which means that it didn't happen, but it should have.
So I don't have much information between 1925 and when he dies in 1947.
Well, here's something we can go into that's not in the book. All right?
Okay.
So they're always, whenever you write a book, or you write anything, there's always other stuff that tends to come along. Because, again, you could research things forever, and you might find it, you might not, but eventually, the guillotine has to come down, and it's done. So there's other information that little bits that come in, and for anybody who's read the book, I can share a couple of things from that period. Anybody who's read the book, or of course will read it, which I'd urge you all to do, and that's not because I make some huge amount of money. I really don't. But if you're interested in it, if you're interested in Aleister Crowley, you should do this. You should go out and read everything you can find about him. You should read things that are negative. You should read things that are positive. You should try to get as wide a view of him as you can. And one of the things you would include, my book, for instance, Secret Agent 666, is not intended as a thoroughgoing biography, because what I'm focused on is a particular aspect of him. I'm focused upon his connection to intelligence or people associated with intelligence, or possible connections there too. That's what you have to tell the story of his life in the process, but there's a lot more detail that you could find and different interpretations of things that you could find. But one of the things that I mentioned in the book is that in the 1930s, there's correspondence between, his name comes up in correspondence between some people who are kind of British internal security people and really this kind of private intelligence agency, which is collecting information on people they believe to be dangerous influences, and Crowley's one of those dangerous influences. But but they find out that that there's a source of information connected to him, which is only identified as M, just by the initial M. And this is a person who is apparently fairly close to him, and is basically informing on it. They're supplying information. And by the way, some of this information goes back to fascist Italy, and it actually goes to the Vatican. There's this, I think he's a Jesuit, Father Ledit in the Vatican, who, among other things, is sort of, compiling, as people in the Vatican do, a kind of compendium of evil and of suspicious persons, and so Crowley is one of those. And so this Father Ledit is getting information from a source in England, from M. Now, in the book, we tried to speculate who M was, and one of the things I knew is that there was a person that Crowley was connected to that was, again, had his intelligence connections, and that was Maxwell Knight. Maxwell Knight, in fact, becomes a very important figure in MI5, and he has an interest in the occult, and then later on he becomes the host of a kiddie show. Okay. So, I'm not kidding you.
No kidding. Oh
so I just thought, well, and Maxwell Knight's nickname, his initial in British intelligence was M. I thought that was a little too obvious, but I said that, well, if you looked at it, the one person that this could be, given that, is that it's Maxwell Knight. Well, for instance, it isn't Maxwell Knight. That the M who was supplying information to Rome on Crowley was Montague Summers. Now, I'm sure the people going, Montague who? Montague Summers, if you look into it, was a kind of, I say a kind of Catholic clergyman, kind of a very curious guy who works on, he viewed himself as a very strict Catholic clergy, a priest, who nevertheless wrote books on vampires, werewolves, witches. Okay, a lot of the stuff. He wrote a book on witchcraft and demonology and werewolves. And by the way, takes all this stuff completely seriously. I mean, and the recording and the books are, I have to admit, for that very reason, quite creepy. So is Montague Summers in his own way. But Summers is the type of person you would assume is exactly the sort of person that Crowley would want nothing to do with, right? This kind of, would-be, witch-burning Catholic priest. Well, no, they're buddies. Okay, well, at least they are companions. They like to get together and talk. They share an interest in what? The occult. Here's the occultist. Here's the fellow who studies the occult and rails against it. But they have a grand old time. And it's that. I mean, there's a whole more involved element, but it's Summers who is then collecting, who's befriending Crowley, but then also is informing on him to various people. And that's an interesting thing in and of itself. I mean, the other sort of angles in this, Montague Summers had a number of little interesting things. In addition to everything else, this shouldn't surprise some people, he was a pedophile.
Oh my God, are you kidding?
And in fact belonged to this whole sort of little secret, this whole secret society, pedophile society.
Oh my God.
That was another one of his pastimes.
Oh my God.
But so that's an interesting fellow as well. But then the other thing that is not in the book at all, and which some people may find interesting. There was a fellow who was a very popular entertainer in Germany, in Berlin, just around the time that Hitler was coming to power. And this was a fellow by the name of Erich Jan Hanussen. And Hanussen was it was a combination of a lot of things. He basically billed himself as a clairvoyant, mind reader, kind of a stage magician, but he earned, an astrologer. He had a very popular, magazine on astrology, and he was a big deal. And this is in Germany as the Weimar Republic. This isn't particularly in like 1929 to 1932. So Hanason was sort of the premier psychic, the sort of premier, I don't know, occult. And in fact, he created this whole sort of palace. You know, he fixed up his apartment and he dubbed it the Palace of the Occult, and he held parties there. And he also befriended, as the Nazi Party rose, he befriended members in the Nazi hierarchy, and eventually through them, in 1932, is introduced to Adolf Hitler himself. And when Hitler, at one point, thought that his political career was in the decline, Hanason becomes a kind of advisor to him. Comes in, argues, no, I've read the stars, the spirits tell me you'll do great things, and predicts that Hitler will become chancellor in January 1933, which he does. Now, the interesting thing about Erich Jan Hanason is that that's not his real name. His real name is Hermann Steinschneider. He's Jewish.
Oh my God.
Okay. So,
but Hitler didn't know he was Jewish?
The friend of in fact, the friend of the essay of the brown shirts in Berlin, a guy who is himself a member of the SA of the brown shirts, has his own Nazi uniform, is a Jew.
Oh my God! And Hitler
now,
didn't know.
The thing is that lots of people know that. I mean, that's not really this big secret. Anybody who was acquainted with Hanason knew his name really wasn't Hanason. And in fact, there's a communist newspaper in that period which is telling anybody who listened that this is Steinschneider, making fun of him. Now, what happens to Hanason is that right after Hitler comes to power, or not long, some weeks after Hitler comes to power, even though Hitler had, he met him and sort of befriended Hanason, Hanason ends up dead. What a surprise. His decomposing body is found in the woods outside Berlin. So the assumption is, and probably a correct one, is that his previous Nazi friends who decided that he had now become an embarrassment decided to get rid of him.
Oh my God. Wow.
Now this is what's kind of interesting. In that period when Hanason is the toast of the town, I mean, look, he is playing big theaters, he's like playing the equivalent of Broadway. He is talked about openly. He's very some people love him, some people hate him, because he had his bad boy side as well. But and his completely immoral approach to things. But there's no way that someone could have been in Berlin and not have noticed Erich Jan Hanason. Now, who was living in Berlin mostly between 1930 and 1932? Aleister Crowley.
No way.
So Crowley had to have been aware of Hanason, and this is the kind of guy that he would have been interested in. I mean, part of it is that Crowley was interested in anybody who would, Hanason would do things like carry out what were almost comic versions of magic rituals. So Crowley would have noticed that. Hanason had sort of orgies on his yacht. Of course, he had a yacht, which look a lot like tantric sex rituals, which Crowley would have recognized. So there's no way Crowley would have ignored him. And even the whole idea of him claiming to have psychic powers, whether Crowley would have been angered by Hanason, whether he would have thought he was a faker, or whether he would have been interested, he would have taken an interest in him. Now, one of the things that I've gotten people, like to look for, Crowley's diaries for that period. One of the things he always did, and it was kind of handy, was that he kept diaries, sort of magical records and diaries, which would record sometimes almost on a daily basis, who he had lunch with, or who he saw, or what was going on, and then what are the sort of rituals he'd performed. The problem with a lot of these things is that sometimes he refers to people by name, and sometimes he refers to them to some bizarre numerological code that he comes up with that only he could decipher. Now, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. Why would you refer to some people openly and other people's identities you carefully disguise? Well, because you don't want anybody, if they're related to this, knowing who you were talking about. So the thing that should be there, I mean, sometimes the things that can be important is something that should be there there and isn't. It's the old thing about something being conspicuous in its absence. So Crowley should say, Hannison, you think he would make some sort of mention, the guy's a faker, I can't stand him, I went to see his show. There's nothing. There's no obvious reference to him at all.
Wow.
So, here again, somebody could argue that, that there's nothing there. He just didn't mention it. But it's almost as if he's being deliberately... something should have come across the radar. So one of the things that in doing the research I would keep coming up with, it's a little bit like the Barbara Bush story, and you'll run across these things that, Aleister Crowley was an advisor to Hitler. Aleister Crowley was, the architect of Nazism. Aleister Crowley taught Hitler, how to speak in public and do a variety of things. It's one of the things you'll find, a whole series of allegations that sort of place Crowley and Hitler together in some way, that Crowley either met Hitler or that Crowley was an influence on him. And this, again, was one of the things that I couldn't find any evidence of. He's in Berlin, but Crowley never, he doesn't get an entree into the Nazi elite. He doesn't have that. He doesn't teach Hitler techniques in public speaking, but Hannison does. So one of the things that became apparent, and again, this only came into focus after I'd written the book, was that a lot of the things that later get attached to Crowley, the relationship he said to have with Hitler, is a reflection of the relationship that Hannison actually had. Now, another thing about Hannison is that there were those people around him who suspected that since Hannison was, knew lots of people, and, well, here's one of the things that Hannison was alleged to do, at least. Those sex parties on his yacht?
Yeah.
What do you suppose he also did while his guests were in various states of undress doing things they might not want known in public?
God, I don't know what.
Photographed them.
Oh!
He made movies.
Oh, my
God. Now you see where we're going. You invite some, wealthy people, I don't know, Nazi party officials, industrialists, whoever else, and you get them liquored up and give them drugs, including mescalin, by the way, which Crowley would know something about. And then you get them all having sex on their lot, and you take a movie, make a sex tape. That's what we call it today.
My.
Now, what could you do with that sex tape? Well, you could blackmail people.
Oh,
Some of those people who would pay a lot of money to make sure that wasn't there, which is another reason, it isn't too surprising why maybe this guy ended up dead.
Oh, my
but,
God.
But Hannison, he held seances in his Palace of the Occult. He would bring people in, and he would hold seances. And in seances, the spirits would communicate. People would divulge secrets. Hannison had his finger on important people and critical information. Now, who would pay to get that information?
Oh.
Who would be curious to know what it was that Adolf Hitler was thinking?
Oh, my God.
Foreign intelligence agencies.
Yes.
What would British intelligence, or Soviet intelligence, or Austrian intelligence, French intelligence give to have someone who could give them someone who had the confidence of the man who was going to become Chancellor of Germany, someone who could tell them what was going on in the higher ranks of German politics and society?
So that would be Crowley.
Well, Hannison, but if Hannison wasn't selling information, he was missing a huge opportunity. Now, the thing that I'd say I suspect, and I only suspect this because, again, it's based purely upon circumstantial evidence, it's based upon the similarities between the two men, it's based upon their presence in the same place, it's based upon common interests, is that the connection that that tries to draw a connection between Crowley and Hitler, but which is really sort of blending things between Crowley and Hannison, is a vague reflection that there was some kind of connection between Crowley and Hannison. That Crowley, again, likely working in the interest of British intelligence, was trying, whether or not he succeeded is a question, to cultivate a relation through Hannison. If he couldn't get to the into further. I mean, I think it may not amount to anything, but it could also be a kind of interesting link.
Awesome. Well, why don't we just finish up with Crowley? So he was a heroin addict, and he was being prescribed morphine for his asthma and bronchitis in his earlier years, and he died. He died at a Hastings boarding house in December of 1947 at the age of 72. Now, this came from a biographer. Now, and hey, now wait a minute. Now, what about this? Was that part true? What I just said? Did he?
Oh, when he's dying at 47 in a boarding house?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, was true? Oh, okay.
He moved around to, the interesting thing is that even though here's a little detail. In 1935, he filed for bankruptcy.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And for the rest of his life, until in the last 12 years of his life, Aleister Crowley was an undischarged bankrupt, which meant that his debts were never paid off.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Now, so here you've got a guy who is, in 1935, an undischarged bankrupt, but who, through the rest of his life, again, he's going to live another 12 years, is never without a roof over his head, is never without his heroin,
where's he get
never
the
without
money?
food, who continues to live reasonably well.
Yeah.
Where's the money coming from?
Yeah. Where? Oh my God!
No.
Don't say the military, the intelligence. Is that what you're gonna?
It comes from a number. I mean, part of it wasn't coming from royalties on books, since they wasn't really drawing much of that. Part of it he got little remittances from the things that he'd written, but frankly, his book never sold enough to make any money off of.
And I heard his poetry was horrible. His poetry was horrible.
Well, you get different opinions. I'm no judge of poetry, so I'll reserve commentary on that. But, there are some people who think this, there are differences of opinion, but you'd have to read it on your own. But he's getting a helping hand from somewhere. I mean, he can mooch off his friends. That's part of it. He can, but he never, his debtors never. His debtors don't really have much of anything to collect.
Yeah.
And he's getting some kind of stipend, and that comes from some official quarter. I mean, he's not rich by any means. He still has to move from one place to another. The building he's living in one of the buildings he's living in London during the war, is hit by a bomb in the Blitz. It's not his glory days. His health is kind of steadily declining, but he's still active in his career. His last hurrah. I just say this is another one of these things, which is a very sort of complicated story. A number of people listening have probably heard of Rudolf Hess.
Yes.
Okay. Rudolf Hess, for a time, was Hitler's right-hand man in the Nazi hierarchy. So when the Nazis are coming to power, Rudolf Hess, German, was a man obsessed by everything occult. So, one of the things you read a lot of this stuff about the Nazis and the occult, and it's one of those things that there's something to it, but, maybe not as much as the History Channel would like you to believe. But Hess was legitimately just a sucker for all of this stuff, or was a believer in much of it, and was very interested in all of these kinds of aspects of it. So one of the things that Hess is most infamous for doing is that after World War II began, in 1941, he gets in a plane and apparently on his own flies from Germany to Scotland with some sort of idea of brokering a peace with England, and then is captured and spends the rest of the war in jail, and then years and years in Spandau prison. So there's a whole sort of realm, there's a whole literature about why did Rudolf Hess do this? Why did he make this flight? Did Hitler know about it? Did Churchill know about it? What was going on? And there are a dozen different theories about this. Most of them quite interesting. All of them, again, based upon the way that you want to interpret the basic facts. The basic facts was that that Hess was an important figure figure in the Nazi Party. He eventually got displaced by Himmler. In 1941, he believed that it was absolutely essential for Germany to have a peace with Britain before they invaded Russia, and he got in a plane, he flew, crash-landed in Scotland, and then spent the rest of his life as a prisoner.
Right.
Okay, those are the basics. Why he did it is the question.
Yeah.
Now, another one of those things that's sometimes been attached to Crowley was that he either, one, had something to do with bringing Hess to England, through magical influence, through astrological influence, or that once he got there, he was involved in interrogating him.
Really?
Now, the thing about, there were any number, there is a kind of plot, how much that, there were people in England who were thinking of ways to bring, the idea of potentially bringing Hess there. There's again, it's a big story now, but there's something to that. He was at least helped along in that decision. The question that interested me more was there anything to these little rumors I picked up that Crowley in some way, one of them was kind of interesting. The British had a kind of high security, they had like their version of Guantanamo, right? And this was a thing called Camp 020. And it was a place sort of on the western edge of London. Ham Common was the other it was called, And what this was is that in the war, very high profile or sensitive German prisoners, most of them Nazi officials, were held there for special interrogation. So this was not a regular military prison. And there were, at least rumored to be, some creative or unorthodox interrogation techniques that were used. Now, there was a fellow, he was actually a pro-German Englishman, who, again, was interned there, or I think he knew someone who was interned, who later claimed that someone said that they had seen, what it boils down to is that one of the people in Ham Common claimed that they had seen Aleister Crowley there during the war, that he was involved in interrogations at Ham Common.
No way.
Okay, well, this is, it's hearsay. It's one person saying what another person said. But, the thing about that, it's like anything else. It's, all right, you have to think of it. You're investigating something. You're a cop. What do? Well, you follow it up. You follow up the lead. Is there anything to this? Okay, maybe it's just a story somebody's making up. Maybe it's not. Is there anything else to it? Well, the first thing you find out is that Ham Common 020 existed. Camp 020 existed. That was real. There were high-profile prisoners there, so that the place is not imaginary. Now, do you ever find anybody else mention anything about Aleister Crowley being there? No, but then why would they mention it? But the interesting thing about Hess, which was, and there's even a question, Hess supposedly was held elsewhere, but there's also the argument that he was interrogated at Ham Common as well. There's all kinds of smoke and mirrors which is going on. But Hess, among other things, when he was captive, argued that the British were drugging him. He believed that they were giving him drugs in his food, and he specifically said that they were giving him what he called Mexican brain poison.
Oh.
Now, that little term, by the way, refers to mescalin, a drug, remember, which Aleister Crowley had a long and intimate history with.
Oh, my.
Remember, this was a man who, 20-odd years before, had not only had extensive personal experience with the drug, he'd given it to other people, and then what did he do? He recorded their reactions.
Oh.
So if you were looking around for someone who had experience with this drug, which, and this is a similar drug that, later on the CIA would test as a truth serum, they're always dosing people with something. But you might call him in as a consultant. You might ask him how much would be enough, what kind of results might we expect in that regard. Now, so there was that little bit. Then then another bit was that when the war broke out, remember, this is 1939, Aleister Crowley is now, fairly old, still a disreputable character. He gets a summons, basically, or a request from the Chief of Naval Intelligence to come see him. And in fact, one of the things, he has a little card, and it tells him the exchange, the telephone exchange that he is to call to make this appointment. Well, I had a friend of mine sort of look through the old records to figure out what the telephone exchange in the Admiralty went to, and the very interesting part is it connects to the office that dealt with prisoner of war interrogation. So,
wow.
It's just these little pieces that mean that maybe there's something to that.
Wow. Well, you sure got a lot of information. Holy cow.
At least they were willing to talk to him about it, and then who knows how it goes from there. But yeah, he dies,
okay,
rather quite...
Let me ask you
quiet
this.
life.
Oh, go ahead. Oh, you didn't finish. That he was getting money. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, he's one of the last things he was accused of was putting a curse on his doctor and killing him.
Yes, that's what I was going to ask you about. They said that when Crowley died, 24 hours later, the doctor died because they thought he had put a curse on him.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's 24 hours, but he does die sometime later, and apparently he thought he was a horrible doctor. But
well, he wasn't he the one that oh my God.
But you get all of these. There are also these whole questions about what his last words were.
Oh yeah. What were they?
There are different versions of it. One of them is that sometimes I hate myself.
Yeah.
Another one was that I am perplexed.
I read that too.
And then there was another one which I'm pretty sure isn't true, because I think it's supposedly Pancho Villa's last words. Which, by the way, even though it has nothing, are my favorite last words I've ever heard recounted. Supposedly, when Pancho Villa was shot and was dying, and one of his friends went to him, his last words were, "Don't let it end like this. Tell them I said something." So.
Oh.
Yeah. No, I can't think of anything. Tell them I said something. Make something up.
Oh my God.
And I heard somebody else attribute that to Crowley, and I doubt if both of them did it in the same way. But it's again one of those things that's apocryphal. If it didn't happen, it was kind of appropriate to that. But there was a whole funeral. Some of his friends, what remained of them, showed up. He was cremated. There's a whole sort of mystery of what happened to all of his ashes. Some of them argue they were all scattered in England. Other argue that some of them got carried by Karl Germer, one of his loyal German followers, to New Jersey and were put in a metal box under an elm tree, which means today somewhere in suburban New Jersey, someone may have a tree in their backyard that has a little box full of Aleister Crowley's ashes in it. But then other people think that they was actually carried off to California somewhere. So who knows? It's Aleister Crowley, the man and the myth, and it's this kind of fascinating combination of both of them that I guess make him such an object of morbid fascination.
Oh wow. Okay. Hold on for 1 second. I'm not sure. Oh God, something happened. Hold on.
Oh, okay.
Hold on. I lost my page where my stream was coming from.
Oh, okay.
I gotta see if I can get it back.
It's not like we lost everything and you have to do it over.
Oh no, oh my God. No, I just lost the page. I don't know what happened to it. Hold on, everybody.
No, that's fine.
I just got to get my page back up. Yeah. Oh no, we're still going. Yep. I just had to change my page. Okay, so I mean I don't know how much more time you have. I've had you on for an hour. You have to teach a class early tomorrow, or?
No, I'm supposed to eat dinner sometime this evening.
Oh, okay. I won't keep you on.
Right.
That was...
but,
honey, I won't keep you on. I so enjoyed. That was absolutely fabulous. Fabulous.
It's my pleasure as well. I hope people got something out of it, and they heard things that are interesting. They can go explore on their own, and they make up their own ideas about it. And there's a lot to there's a lot to look into. There are lots of mysteries to explore.
Oh my God, I know.
So.
And seems like you're having a good time doing that.
Yeah, it keeps me off the street, I guess, or it keeps me occupied. But I don't know. Maybe sometime in the future we can talk about other things like weird cults and UFOs over Utah and.
Oh yeah. I'd love to have you back.
And any variety of things. And I probably have to put in. Can I put in a plug for something?
Yes.
Okay. There's a friend of mine, a fellow that I co-authored a book with a few years ago, a thing called Empire of the Wheel. Walter Bosley is his name, and he would want me to mention Empire of the Wheel. Empire of the Wheel was, I think, primarily Walter's project, but he sort of brought me into it, and it is a very interesting story about what appear to be sort of a rash of occult-influenced murders in Southern California in 1915.
Is that nonfiction?
Yeah, it's nonfiction. It was one of those things that Walter approached me about it, and I guess because of other weird things, you do things and then people think you're interested in other things. And when he first sort of brought that to me and was explaining is that, I think there were this series of what appear to be unexplained deaths and suicides, but he said, I think there's a link between them, and I think they're ritual murders.
Oh my God, you want to come back and you want to do a show on that?
But if we did, we certainly want to involve Walter in it, because Walter has taken this and sort of carried it on further.
So, but this is real. This is real, and it's nonfiction.
Yeah.
Okay, I love it.
And it was one of those things that, when he first approached me, I said, I'm not sure there's anything to it. And then the more I looked into it, I thought, there's kind of something to it, because this is kind of weird. But it all begins with people in San Bernardino, California, find a strange woman drowned in a local lake, and no one knows who she is. And she's never identified, and no one can figure out how she got into the lake, or where she came from, or who she was, and then it just kind of grows from there.
I love it.
Okay.
Oh, I love it. Yes. Now, one of you will have to be on Skype, and one will be, you could be on the phone, but he'll have to be on Skype, because I don't have.
I think that he could do that, but I'll contact Walter and see if he's still interested in doing that, and.
That would be awesome. I love it was never solved, right?
No.
I love it. Love it. We love that kind of stuff.
All right.
And then what about your book? I'm showing them your book, Your Secret Agent 666.
Yeah.
I saw it on the pharaohhouse.com, but it's on Amazon.
It's on Amazon. Yeah, you can buy it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, wherever finer books are sold online, or occasionally in bookstores as well. And and if they're interested in that, it's one of those things that in terms of if they're familiar with Crowley, this may look at an aspect that they haven't seen before. If they're interested in the kind of weird interconnection, and this is one of the things I keep running across between sort of occultism or esoteric groups and intelligence. And it's like, I don't know, it's like moths drawn to the light or something.
Yeah.
But there is this kind of interesting. Crowley himself is a kind of symptom of something or an example of something that has a larger manifestation to it. So I think they would find something of interest there, thought-provoking, enraging, whatever it might be. The rest of it is hunting various spies, one kind or another. So I'm working on a book that deals with American spies in early Bolshevik Russia, and then also sort of early Soviet spies in America, and the two flip sides of that.
Wow.
So
well, if you ever write a paranormal book, let me know.
I don't know. I don't know whether that's possible at this point in time, but those are... That's the kind of, you kind of follow your interest, and that's where they go, and you find these things that nobody really looks into, and then, you got to do it.
Dr. Spence, I want to thank you so very much for being on the show. And please, contact. I want to have you back on the show. It won't be until June because I'm booked through all the way through May. So it'll have to be in June. Let me know. Talk to your friend and let me know if you guys want to come on and talk about that.
Yeah. I certainly will.
Oh,
well, anyway, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and good night, and good night to everybody.
Thank you so much. Say good night, everybody, to Dr. Spence. Yay, they're saying good night. Thank you so much. I really, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much.
Great. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Oh, my God. Isn't he awesome? Isn't that awesome? Oh, it's so nice to have guests like that. I love it. Hey, everybody, thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I've got, God, you know what? This is going to be, here, I'm going to see if I can, oh, my gosh. I'll see if I can do shout-outs. Let me see if I can make this small enough. Wasn't he an awesome guest? Did you guys enjoy the show? Do you want me to do some shout outs? Hey, guess what? I'm looking, I want to do the Bohemian Grove. We were going to talk a little bit about that tonight, but the show was already 2 hours. I really want to do Bohemian Grove. I only live about an hour and 20 minutes from that place, and I will not go into those woods. Okay, so guess what? Next Thursday, oh, you're welcome. Hi, everybody. Hey, next Thursday, the Day at Love Pass in Russia. That's going to be awesome. I've been wanting to do a show on that for so long. And Paul Eno is going to be my guest. He's extremely intelligent, and he has his own radio show on CBS. So it should be a really good show. And guess what? On the 26th, the last Thursday of the month, I have Deanna Simpson. Now, she's the one that has a demonic house in, I guess it's Hanover, Pennsylvania. And the news channel, there was a news channel in her house, and one of the news people were sitting at the table with her, and he was actually attacked, and that was put on camera. And I'll show that to you guys because she told me I could use that on the show. And then following the show on the 26th, Dave Spinks, my buddy, I don't know if Dave is still here, he's going to be doing a live show. And so following my show, we're going to move right over to Dave's show. He's going to be at an antique mall. And it's going to be a live investigation, so that should be an awesome show. So you'll get a double 2 shows on the 26th. And, oh my gosh, I got so much going on. Anyway, I want to thank everybody for always joining me every week. I love you guys a lot. I really appreciate you being here with me. So let me see if I can do some shout outs. Yeah, Bohemian Grove, that's right, David. Oh my God, I want to do that. And I will find somebody to do that show with me. I will find someone. So let me see about the shout outs. Maybe, let me see if I can bring it up here. Hold on. Let me see if I can get it up here. I better not. I better not do that. All right. So Butter, I'm gonna say shout outs. Butterfly Kisses, I Whip, Steph. Oh God, here we go. Oh my God, I just lost it. Hold on. All right, Hidden Beneath, Stepharoo, I Whip, Luscious Huntress, Beat Path, Trent, Hidden Beneath, Liz, F Warrior, Medra Knight, Paraghoster, Fox Newbold, Yvonne Bessett, David Coffin, Mary Dallas. Put your names in, guys, and I'll do a shout out for you. Oh God, I forgot. Oh, White Light, Quizzle, Fox Newbold. Oh, I think I said that. That's Fox Newbold Returns. Okay. Hey, I forgot to tell YouTube Live, Chipper, Michael Banks. Oh, love you too, Michael. Love you guys. Guess what? Got another show tomorrow night. Elaine Esquire, Atlanti, Scotia. I guess, okay, so guess what, guys? I forgot. I got another show tomorrow night. Dave Spinks is joining me, and guess what? Andrea Perrin. It should be an awesome show. She's got stuff to tell you guys. Paradigm Shift Paranormal. So don't forget, another show tomorrow night, same time, 6 o'clock Pacific, 9 Eastern. Join me here. I'll post on Google. Scowling Wolf. Cindy Price. So, okay, another show tomorrow night. Hope you be there with me. Beat Path. Yeah, another show. My husband goes, what are you doing? 2 shows a week now? It just happened to be that way. But if something really good comes up, I will do a second show during the week. You guys, I'm waving back. Thank you. Oh, Ginger. Hi. Okay, so tomorrow night, second show. Don't forget, Andrea's got a lot to say. I'm her open forum. Anytime she wants to talk to her fans, I'm here for her. And she had a frightening experience with the paranormal, and she's going to talk about that plus some other things. Per Boogaloo. Hi, everybody. Shelly. Did I miss anybody? Did I miss anybody? Okay. Got another 2-hour show. Oh, thank you so much. Elaine McKee. Male something Michael. Rick Garrett. Yeah, I'm really excited. I kind of know what she's going to say, but I'll let her talk about it. So everybody, do you like my red and black tonight? Now tomorrow night I'm not going to wear red because Andrea loves purple, so I'll probably do last time I did purple, so I'll do lavender tomorrow. I have a lavender one. Oh, yeah, 2 hours. Okay, everybody. Thank you. Love you guys. So, Starry. I didn't say hi to Starry. Okay, did anybody else I miss before I go? Did I forget anybody? Okay, I'm hungry. I want to eat dinner now. So everybody, thank you so much. I love you guys. Thank you for being here every week with me. Don't forget to share my shows, and let's make this grow. And I'll see you tomorrow night. Okay? So everybody, good night. I love you. Good night. Thank you.